Hi, this is Andrew Sears again, and this lecture is going to focus on systemic injustice and trauma-informed multicultural counseling. I'm really excited about this topic because I think it's something that's going to be essential for our students to understand in the context. And it's also, I think, going to help address a common dilemma that a lot of our students face in working with clients. So, in understanding whenever you take a multicultural counseling course, um, why is this course in the curriculum? Why does it exist? What's kind of the history behind that course? I explained this four quadrant diagram of how universities are organized, and you kind of have different disciplines: individual, collective, internal, and external. And across these disciplines, counseling really belongs in this, individual and internal, focused domain. Now, it would like to say it's across all four quadrants, but the reality is historically that's where it's existed. And even now, even really good social justice focused counseling, 90% of what you're doing is still in this quadrant. You have these other quadrants. But what's happened is there's been a critique of counseling, and the critique of counseling is it says that you kind of have this cultural assimilation thing going, that we live in an American culture, very individualistic, and we'll focus on how people feel. But the reality is, and the critique is, by not advocating for systemic change, counseling might help a few individuals while not changing the societal dysfunctions that are causing the problem. So, you're saving you might have, thousands and thousands of, hundreds of thousands or millions of people experiencing racism, and you're helping, heal people of racial trauma, but you're not addressing the bigger picture. So that's why social justice and advocacy have started to be a much more significant aspect of counseling. And so, if you look at the need for advocacy and systemic change, so this curriculum has been added. So, clients, you might add some things that, how do you think about clients that are dealing with collective trauma? So that could be racial trauma, that could be, gender-based trauma, that could be class trauma. But then also a lot of this type of course is going to address things on counselor development, counselor competency. So how do you address bias, bigotry and prejudice? How do you, do this kind of immersion thing that I'm saying in identity development? How do you have immerse yourself across race, class, and how do you, and these are some of the tips that we would often provide in terms of counselor development. So it's not just about head, it's about, immersing yourself. Now, the need for advocacy is, how do you create just laws? How do you create healthy societal structures? How do you have just teaching of history? How do you have, effective macroeconomic development? Within organizations, how do you create, remove structural barriers for people of color or for women in leadership and things along those lines? So the point of all that is to say this is kind of the historical context, and there's been a couple social justice lessons that have been learned for counselors. So to better empathize with client experience, for those experiencing systemic injustice, it's critical to understand the systemic perspective. So a lot of the material in this course is going to help flesh out that systemic perspective. So it's not just, understanding about racism, it's understanding for different groups and for each person's social location or collective identity. There's going to be different ways they experience racism. The way someone who's, say, Chinese American is going to experience racism in a very different way than someone who's African American. So that's, number one. Number two is, the lesson that's been learned in the field is that counseling without complementary actions to create systematic change or system change can perpetuate systemic injustice. So ultimately, these are some of the ways that holistic ministry across four quadrants. So, you can address a lot of these individual things, but you can also provide, this quadrant I would say is more the relief quadrant. But then you have, a lot of principles that come from Christian community development and from churches. of indigenous leadership development and creating, groups and things along those lines, creating healthy, communities. And here you get a lot of the societal things, so, that I mentioned. So this is kind of holistic ministry across all four quadrants. So what's my point of this is that, a lot of the work in counseling is really focused on these two quadrants. It's focused on the personal and the societal, but you have to also be thinking about these quadrants too. And I think that that's part of where Christian organizations and ministries are particularly strong in these quadrants. So I think it's just worth recognizing that churches are really good at building healthy community. The Black church arguably has had the biggest influence, positive influence for the Black community in the United States out of any organization or anything in the United States, and that's kind of really largely coming from this cultural quadrant that eventually went into the societal quadrant through the civil rights movement. So the third lesson in this is that most advocacy training programs for counselors, and I would include the core textbook, and focuses too much on systems and ignores the physical and cultural quadrant. So what's the implication of that? Well, you can try to change the whole world and change all the laws with clients, but a lot of times what they really need is they need to know how to go to the food bank, or they need to, know how to get housing and, housing vouchers. A lot of that goes into the case management space, right? So now there's a fourth lesson that I want to talk about. And this is where I feel like, counselors they have this awakening. They're like, wow, I can't believe that I missed this systemic perspective. It's so important to have this systemic perspective. But then I feel like they kind of often will misapply that. And I've seen this in urban ministry a lot. And what it is it kind of fails to recognize the social location of clients. So if you're a client and you're under-resourced, your ability to make societal change is really limited. So, applying the serenity prayer, you kind of have this, the serenity prayer, God, give me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change and the courage to change the things I can. So this quadrant, these top two quadrants, really you have more influence over. You can work on your own personal stuff in counseling. You can, try to get better food. You can try to, work on your physical health. Changing the world so that there's just laws, it's going to take a long time. And generally, that's rich people have the influence in the United States. That's how the United States works for the most part. So, as a counselor, it's important to acknowledge the reality of these problems, right? So if you're counseling someone who's experiencing systemic injustice, it's critical that you are able to kind of speak to where people are at. But for clients, they still have to kind of focus on where they can bring change. So a common mistake when they learn about the importance of advocacy is that they enable clients, and I put themselves. Honestly, I see this more often for people involved in urban ministry and counseling. They avoid their own personal change by overemphasizing change in the world. I can name hundreds of people who they've experienced horrible traumas personally, and what they do is they just they're in urban ministry, and instead of dealing with that stuff themselves, they externalize it and they try to change the world. Well, they're projecting their trauma onto other people, and then they end up hurting people. So that's why this is important. So not only for yourself, but for clients, to think about that. I was a case study of that in my late 20s, early 30s. Is I was one of those people. So the fifth thing that I want to talk about is the intersection of the systemic lens and client trauma. So one of the most significant points of this course is that as counselors, we have to be able to validate the pain and trauma of our client's experience. So everyone gets that one of the most painful things is when someone who has deep trauma is to deny their trauma. So that's like, duh. But what happens is the way the systemic lens often gets applied in real social settings. So say like a university campus, or some other context, could be in a church. the systemic lens, it is really important to validate the trauma of the non-dominant group. So a group experiences racism or sexism or, class-related trauma. You have to apply the systemic lens. It's really important. But depending on how that gets applied, it can be misapplied to a group that invalidates legitimate pain and trauma of individuals. So an example, applying the systemic racial lens to white clients can feel like you're invalidating, group trauma across social class. So let me just use a more concrete example. Say you got someone who's 40 years old, they go back to college, they're on a uber left-wing college campus. This person, he's a white male. He, grew up extremely low income in the projects, has, history of he was sexually abused and went into the military, experienced trauma there, had, a lot of, was, say in hundreds of fights in the projects. So you unpack that, and what I would say, that person you're probably going to diagnose as having complex trauma. But if you look at it from a social justice lens, that person also has collective trauma, but it's not, he's white male, so it's not racial trauma, it's not gender trauma, it's actually social class trauma. Because, in projects, he may have been in an environment where everyone was, exposed to extraordinary violence, extraordinary sexual abuse. But then he goes to say a left-wing college campus where in half his courses, he's becoming a counselor, in half his courses, he's basically told that he's the oppressor as a white male. And he goes off on people. What's happening? Well, you could just say he's has white male privilege and he just doesn't want to give up his white male privilege. Or you could kind of unpack that and you could say, well, maybe what's going on is this guy has unresolved collective class trauma, and every time he's put into a box of being the oppressor, what he really needs is he's saying, I need someone who's going to validate the pain that I've been through. And he needs that unpacked. So this happens, and I use the white male example, but this can happen across, race, where you get, someone who has had racial trauma and they're in a white church. And, what's happening is politicians are weaponizing the trauma of one group. So that guy, he could listen to honestly a Trump speech and all of a sudden decide that his, trauma is, and, people treating him like that, it gets weaponized and then he becomes, militant in ways that are harmful. The same type of thing can happen racially, across other groups. So politicians are kind of weaponizing the trauma of one group and applying, by applying a single lens. So, Trump is right now he's applying the class lens and he's saying, yes, I hear your pain. You have this extraordinary pain. And then he's weaponizing people. Other groups will do that across race. So what's the point? What's the principle here? I think the principle is start with client. In counseling, you always start with where clients are, and what that means is that most clients are going to first focus on their own collective trauma. So where they were the oppressed. So for my own experience, me being a white male, whenever I started to learn the systemic perspective, I was most interested in understanding social class. I grew up poor white. There's a whole lot of collective class trauma in my environment. I learned to appreciate the systemic lens because it was useful in my own healing process. Once I got that, then after I kind of got my own needs met, then I was able to say, okay, well, there's other roles that I'm in where I might be in the, and I don't like to use the term the oppressor, right? But just within the, social justice lens. So, I'm a white male, right? So there's a racial lens where I have some privilege. There's a gender lens where I have some privilege. And then, I'm more able to deal with that. So just recognizing that you got to start with where they're at. So what does that mean? And I talked about this race, class, and gender triangle. So there's another way to apply that. So if someone's lower class white male, they're going to be here. Someone's white female, they might be here on this triangle. And then you have black middle class. So what you got to do, and what's helpful is, um, you know, and this was kind of my experience. I had to find groups that could meet me here. If I went to this left wing, university, I actually first learned from the black community. It was a African American woman who was married to a white guy in the projects who helped me unpack my class issues. But with that, the black church was more in this space. I needed to go to groups that could help me process my own collective trauma that was here. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to, match people with groups that's going to help them. So for example, across social class, these might be some groups that are good across social class. So 12-step groups, for men are groups, that are healing trauma. It could be war trauma or other types of trauma, veteran male survivor groups, church men's groups at, lower income churches. So all those things can be very helpful for people who've experienced, say, social class trauma. The same type of thing for women, single gender groups that where they're healing from domestic violence or abuse survivors, or church women's groups in churches that are going to be, more aligned with, women-centered values. And then, racially, it might be ethnic churches or men's groups or fraternities or things along those lines. So the point of this, there's a couple points. I think that one of the common mistakes is that counselors in society often try to get clients with collective trauma experiences to first take on the identity of an oppressor rather than starting with where they're at. So it's going to be a lot easier to get people to start where they're at. And then, a lot of times with collective trauma, it is often most healed effectively collectively. Some of it will be individual, but some of it will be collective. Through my own process, I had to do individual counseling. So I have PTSD, but the reality was I couldn't get to the roots of that trauma until I was around a bunch of other people who had experienced something similar. We all talked about it, and it helped diffuse that. So all those things can be helpful. Hopefully this is helpful to look at the world through this lens of, okay, why is the social justice lens helpful? How does it get applied effectively? How does it get misapplied? How does that relate to this topic of collective trauma? And what are some of the principles that we can apply in that? So if you have any questions, please ask your faculty member.